Edy, welcome to the Science of Psychotherapy. It's so great to meet you.
It's great to meet you too, Matt.
And Richard
And
here as well.
Richard.
Yes, yes. I hang around in the offside. It's really wonderful to have you here. I just love the way we keep meeting new and fascinating people. And your bio sort of came across my desk. And you talk, we've mentioned how your work is focused around grief, although I'm sure you cover lots of other areas in that framework. And your wonderful book, we'll talk a bit more about that. And we've given a bit of an introduction to you, Edy, but I just find it fascinating what lands people in the space that they work in. Can you give us some sort of insight in what took you from being mild-mannered Edy into a fascinating sort of grief recovery, Edy?
So, it's always such a great question because there's so many ways to answer it, right? I mean, I could, go down the path, the road of, well, I was born and, and then
at a very young age, yes.
Right, at a very young age. And yet perhaps that is actually the point of the story, is that initial separation is one of grief, and when we leave the womb there is grief. And so I what has impacted me were the attachments that I've had and the losses that I've had as a result of those attachments, because of a death, because of a partnership gone wrong, because of leaving a place I didn't want to leave, and realized that really grief just kind of follows us along the way. We might not name it as such. And it wasn't until I was 27 when I lost my partner, Paul, to lung cancer, that everything everything all at once hit. And so the patterning of personality and charisma and desire were all impacted by this thing called grief and loss of a partner through death, and yet got me to a place of realizing there'd been all these other grief patterning that had occurred over time. And it was a pivot point. Now, we all have pivot points, in therapy, we call them the nodal points, those nodal points. But truly, this was a pivot, a nodal point, a point of the hero-shiro journey where everything I knew before was forever changed.
Yeah, so a loss at 27, that's quite young, and I'm just wondering if we can just stay with the story for a minute. What were you doing at 27? Were you studying psychology and this sort of thing, or where were you at?
Well, I was not studying psychology. I was actually Paul and I were actors together, and he was ready to go on Broadway in New York. We lived in New York, and we used to just co-act together at times. We would create our own shows for friends and family. I was auditioning out in the theater world, and when he died, and I was also in school, and I was going to take theater and my knowledge of theater and go into the corporate world and teach about drugs and abuse and burnout. And so that's what I was going to do. And he dies, and everyone around me says, "Oh, don't worry, darling. It's okay," in that lovely, patronizing voice that no one should ever use. And I don't use the word should, except sometimes. And that was not good enough. You're young and you'll find someone else. You're young and you'll find someone else. That wasn't the point. And what his death did was reorganize my thoughts about how I was going to spend the rest of my life, and how I was going to honor who he was, my love for him, while also being able to teach people, hopefully, that grief surrounds us in ways that we cannot even imagine. So there was the grief of the loss of Paul, but then there was also the realization that as this major emotion was surfacing, what was happening were all of the things that I had never really dealt with, that had fractured me, the teasing or some sexual abuse thrown in there for good measure. All of a sudden, I had to face that which I did not want to face. And that is what made it the Hero Shiro journey. That was
Yeah.
the great departure. That was the point where the inmost cave, Joseph Campbell's brilliance, had to be dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on something, and I just sort of circled back a little bit into what you've been saying and just feedback there, because both Matt and I have been involved in the entertainment world. I was actually an actor till I was 45, full time. And there was a lot that I learned from that. And I'm just wondering, as we're going into this hero's journey and some of the other aspects, going back to that thing of how that might have prepared you, given you these other experiences that acting gives you the opportunity, these other characters that you've played. Because at 27, there's only a certain amount of experience that we can have, but there's a lot that we can investigate in that theatrical sort of experience. Did that give you any additional little points of reference?
So I was trained as a Shakespearean actor. And if you are trained as a Shakespearean actor, your greatest tool is your voice. In other types of theater, certainly it's your voice, it's your body, but truly it is how you are going to project and own that character. And I think that what acting did is tenfold, because it wasn't just about finding my voice as an actor, but then using the voice I found as an actor and use it as a clinician, and use it as a student, and use it with what I call my clients, my peeps. And I realized that I could influence and impact the way someone's judge or critic or internal negative voices were lying within their hearts and their souls and their guts and their minds, by actually turning up a turn of phrase, using a little bit of a different voice, using the tenor of my voice to impact some change emotionally, physically, intuitively within that person.
Beautiful answer. And it is exactly the frame of something that I think we need to do a lot more in the therapeutic world. In fact, I did a workshop that was almost everything I know in psychotherapy I learned in acting school, which is really well done. And you've got that same frame. How to improvise with ourselves is a skill that we can learn. And so those are, I'm sure, things that you embed without being overt, but just embed just out of your nature into the way you teach and into the way you frame your work. And if we can perhaps now flow back into this grief recovery, you've given us some lovely insights into the subtleties of approach that you can bring in. And there was also one that you mentioned there as you were going through this sexual grief, sexual issues there. That just caught my ear. Can we just let you wax lyrical in your own voice there as to what you think is important now?
Let me tap into the grief piece. And then what I'd love to do is introduce your audience to sexual grief, because the only way that term right now presently is defined is the grief that someone feels upon losing their partner, and it is the loss of a sexual partner. So I didn't even know that it existed within that, kind of framework. But the framework that I bring to the audience around sexual grief is as different from that as apples are to the dirt.
Wow. Yes.
Okay.
Not just chalk and cheese. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
no. Okay. So but let me just get back to the grief piece. And I would love to say just one more thing about the theater, which is that when we can be spontaneous within our characters, then we can be spontaneous within ourselves. We learn how to become more spontaneous. And it is that spontaneity. It is being able to see that you can play so many different roles as you deal with grief, as you are a parent, as you are a child to your parent, as you are someone who carries the grief of losing a parent and losing a partner, and that all of those different roles will manifest in different ways. And so part of the techniques that I use are psychodrama, role play, and the use of the psychodrama is to be able to individually and in groups bring in what are called the double or the mirroring, which enables, I think, a much fuller expression of that which we often don't have words for. So I wanted to just kind of bring that segue in, because often as clinicians, because we don't know it, we don't understand psychodrama or role play or bringing Gestalt work into the room because we're trained in a certain way. I offer not to be afraid. Don't be afraid of bringing this in, even if it's in the minutest of ways. So, because I think that we are so guarded and we don't have language around that which we don't want to talk about.
Yeah, there's some real resources there that need to that can be developed, I guess, and I guess every client has they're at a different level as to where they're at with those, bringing those resources alive. Just very, very quickly, psychodrama, for those that are not familiar with the term, just a very brief explanation.
Sure. So psychodrama is a way of bringing an issue alive in the room. And it's often done in groups. I do it also, individually, because I know psychodrama, but when it's done, Dr. Moreno, he actually was from New York, Beacon, New York. He created psychodrama. And if you want to look him up, you just put Moreno into, your search bar and you will find his amazing work. But what he did was he believed that if you could take an issue and you could bring it alive, and he used people in the audience or people within a sacred group to embody mother, father of what he called the protagonist, who was the chosen person to bring in their issue around a mother or around shame, and would perhaps bring in or invite people to play, if you will, the aspects of shame at 12, shame at 20, shame at 50, or who influenced. And so there were ways in which that protagonist could then in real time teach someone what they hear or feel in their body, and teach that person to embody that, and they could then interact with that aspect of themselves in real time and then break it down. And what we find is it actually changes the brain in beautiful, amazing ways. And that's the goal. I'm sorry it wasn't so short, but
No.
No,
That's
it's beautiful.
fantastic.
It's beautiful and important. An important thing for people to understand the extent to which they vary themselves in the day. I mean, I actually talk about it just in the simplicity of language. I am me. I is sort of the all of you. Me is the thing that you're doing at the time, and the verb is where it comes from. So this beautiful thing in psychodrama where you're creating these different scenarios where you suddenly discover who you can be. And for me, it was extraordinary to to find in me the goodie, find in me the baddie, to find that I could be that, which did help me understand how clients can do that, and help me explain to clients who you're being at the moment is not all you can be, and so on and so forth. And Moreno brings this out so beautifully. He's wonderful.
Beautifully. And then to have compassion for the bad, for the part of you that maybe is that shame-based person. And when you can couple it and with forgiveness or with kindness, and you never thought you could get there. Or let's bring it back to grief. You have remorse around how you handled the loss, or you handled someone's illness leading up to the loss. And that remorse, you are so hard on yourself, and remorse walks with you and follows you wherever you go and interact. And all you want to do is push it away, instead inviting it in and saying, okay, there was a reason you showed up. And let me talk to you. Let me hear you. Let me have compassion for you. Compassion. Are you nuts? And it's like, no. Let's try that just for a moment. I promise you don't have to walk away with your compassion, should you not want to. But you can. And then I'm out of the role of like a therapist, and I'm more in the role of witness and guide. And that then also empowers the client. And do I do this in groups? Yes, but I love when it happens with a couple, or when I do this one-on-one, and it can happen.
Now, you mentioned guide, and you've mentioned Campbell and Hero's Journey. So I'm curious to know just how much of, sort of the hero's journey is a framework for navigation for you.
Hero and Shiro. Yes, that's right. So
now, and it's interesting because someone said to me, because I do use the hero Shiro, that the way that that Campbell wrote was really for all people, even though he might have, and I must, honor that as well, that I do feel that his mentality was all inclusive and more generic than his time would have even understood or known. And with that said, I still like the hero Shiro. And I would say that the complexity of the hero's journey and the facets of the hero's journey certainly is a complement to my view in the room. And I see that so much of the work is going to the innermost cave, which is that place, for anyone who doesn't know what that is that place where we deal with that which we don't want to speak of, like grief, like sex, or like trauma. And as I say to people, I talk about the three things people do not want to talk about: grief, sex, and trauma. And I see that they are very connected, absolutely. And as a sex therapist, I see that the trauma piece and the sex piece and the grief piece really very much mingle, and they're at each other's throats, and they also love to partner and play havoc. And they love to do something that I talk about in this new book, which right now my working title is Healing Sexual Grief, Reclaim the Self, from Loathing to Liberation to Love. And the loathing part comes in, it's the grief. It's what people often feel when they are within the sexual grief response. And I'm going to define sexual grief for you and for your audience. It is a natural response to an unnatural, sexually traumatic event or experience that leaves the person it attaches itself to feeling like a hostage. And I say a natural response because it's natural to an unnatural sexually traumatic event or experience, because I'm not just talking about, nor am I diminishing the experience of sexual abuse, sexual violence, or domestic violence. However, it is a yes and. And that yes and, to me, is really important. Because if we go along the developmental timeline, i.e. from in utero, birth, all the way to the aging and dying process, sexual grief loves to play its hand. In utero, with the perinatal grief that a mother may feel, that child then takes on and is born and has low self-esteem from that moment of birth, to the unwanted child that is born to a family that keeps them nice, except that unwanted child, watching how others are treated within the family, knows they were unwanted. And as a result of being unwanted, has cognitive difficulties, has difficulty connecting, formal, good, primal sexual relationships. And as a result, has self-loathing and cannot form intimacy with another, has difficulty finding, securing successful jobs, or even learning. Let's go to the young woman who doesn't know she's getting her menses at 9, has never been told, and feels that at 9, when this happens to her, she thinks she's bleeding to death. And sadly, this is occurring in our fractured and fragmented cultures, Black and brown societies, and in many cultures where things are not explained. And I could go on and on for whatever culture that is, and I would not in any way want to leave anyone out, so I'm making it very, very broad.
Yes, and that a worldwide perspective.
Yes,
when you
that's right.
travel, and this
That's
is one of
right.
the beauties of travel, is to walk through these different atmospheres
That's
that
exactly
you
right.
can
So
from one border to another.
So right. And so that young girl, every time she gets her menses, because she hasn't gotten any kind of help, she gets terrified. And that terror then shuts her down the week before, the week after, and she can't function. Or the male or female, and it is male or female, that has erectile dysfunction or goes through menopause, and the sexual grief, the loss of self, the loss of a sense of self, that everyone that I've just mentioned goes through, and everything in between. And add to that people with disabilities who are hidden away and are not allowed to find their own sexual expression, and there is a loss of self and a loathing that nobody gets to actually talk about, and they don't, within their own voices, whatever those voices are, and within the LGBTQ plus communities. So sexual grief is a natural response to an unnatural, sexually traumatic event or experience that leaves its taker feeling as if they're held hostage.
Yeah, that word hostage, that's a very powerful word
It
to
is.
use, that really resonates. So let's just, if you don't mind, let's just expand on that that word hostage, because I think that's I don't think I've actually heard that word used in this context. So
No, it's beautifully unique, and you're right, Matt. You're right there. Now, I'm a little older than everybody, and I know what you're talking about. I have a personal experience of this. I mean, there's as you're saying, there's there can be dramatic effects, and certainly particularly in trauma, where, you know, before the trauma you're sexually self-contained, and after the trauma you're a sexual hostage. But then, of course, there's the simpler ones which just change you when you go, oh dear, I know I'm at an age now, and I went through a period where I had to re-examine my self-concept of potency.
Yes.
Now, I have a beautiful, gorgeous, and thoughtful and heartfelt wife, and we just rediscovered it, which is cool. You know, we went through, but there was sure a period of time where I thought, what the, who the, and it felt like someone had me by the
And you
throat.
held, that's right. That's right.
And
That's right.
that wasn't a dramatic one. I mean, this is just a natural, you know, changing of
It's a natural,
biology.
it's part of aging. That's right. And so that's why I'm touching upon the developmental piece. And let me also thank you for sharing that, because you say you shrug, but you see I know I am a woman, and I do, identify as she and her, but I feel that men have sadly gotten lost, and they have sadly gotten lost in many of these conversations.
Mm.
And my book is written for people, period.
Mm. Mm.
And the chapters are broken down in such a way as to say, if you identify with this, great. If you don't, skip it, because obviously you're not going through menopause, but you may be going through this, or you may have a series of things that have affected you. And it is less about one's performance and more about the grief and the loss of self that is incurred when sexual grief takes over. And when it takes over, I liken it to, it is the hostage taker. And the hostage taker, as in most of the movies we see hostage takers, want something. They want something dearly. They want a sex change operation for their partner. They want money. They want to live a better life, or they want to be seen. And so if we think of sexual grief as the hostage taker that wants something, it does. It wants to be seen, but it's not giving you necessarily the overt clues as to what's going to help it be seen. And that's where this book offers insights into, oh, so this is why I feel the way I feel. This is why it's hard for me to go on a first date, or to talk, or to have a voice, or to feel like I've got love of myself. And the liberation piece in Reclaim the Self, from loathing to liberation, the liberation piece is in the book. I teach everyone how to be their own hostage negotiators. And what is that first strategy? And you're both shaking your head. Yes. And is it from a psychological framework to some degree, but it's also a framework that is used, within our communities of, the FBI and police people and strategies to help people be free, right? And so it is the idea here that first strategy is curiosity across the board. And when we become curious within our own sexual grief mentality, then we can start to ask questions. Okay, so when you show up, and what happens? What happens when I shut down? What happens when I get what I call a pop-up memory that stops me from being able to go on the date, or go on that job interview, or feel like I can give myself some better messaging than I'm giving myself? And I call it curiosity, but I do a much deeper dive in the book. But curiosity, the reason we don't want to be curious and what is because it causes anxiety. And when anxiety is present, what do we want to do? Let me run for the hills. I want to get as far away from you as possible. But what we know is when we can actually be curious about our anxiety and step into it, it diminishes it.
I'm having all of these flashbacks from hostage movies where the hostage negotiator is asking, so tell me about your life, trying to get rapport.
Yes. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, curiosity is a huge, it's part of my main thesis in the work I'm doing. And one of the problems that I've sort of come across in that is that we get stuck in sort of the area of curiosity that people are familiar with, which is the curiosity for investigation. So we get very anxious about that. What am I going to find? And we get scared about what we'll discover. But it's these other aspects that you've talked about them in already. But it's that curiosity, that information that comes from playfulness, from not being regulated. Yes. And because I argue that we have a curiosity, meaning that open, forward, engaging thing, for meaning. So it's not just this unpleasant, difficult, hard, traumatic experience.
No, not at all.
Curiosity changes it. So it's this will be wonderful to see the way you've written about this in the book. I'm so looking forward to that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I again, it's like there are so many ways to describe what curiosity is, or what the experience of curiosity. And it's like going back to the child, going back to child's play and having wonderment, not with some conceived notion of what the outcome will be, but rather, oh my goodness, gee, I wonder what this feels like. And so through the curiosity, it is those what I call time in moments. You know how we say to our kids, or maybe even we say to ourselves, you got to take a time out moment. Well, I actually have turned that around to, I want you to take a time in moment. And that's when you get to actually explore yourself in ways that you never imagined you would. And the time in moment is part of the curiosity, but it's actually part of the entire tenor of the book. Take that time in moment, breathe. From theater, there's a warm-up called trilling. It's a warm-up of the mouth, and I'm going to make a fool of myself, but I don't really care. And it looks like this, and it sounds like this. But the thing is that when you do that in a session and you ask a client to join you, it breaks something in the mind. And then you say to the client, okay, I call them my peeps. Hey, you know what? Tell me, what did your lips feel like? And what did your tongue feel like? And were you able to think of anything else when you did it? No. Okay, so this might be something that when you go into that self-doubt or self-loathing moment, that you actually make a decision to do the trilling.
It's fabulous. It's fabulous. I'm just, my head's just going through 50,000 neuroscience and things, and the motor cortex and things. And I mean, I do a lot of work with the hands, and because the other thing I point out is that the lips and teeth are the other most sensitive areas, and we tend to take things in through our lips and tongue. And here's this wonderful thing. I mean, we used to do this in acting school, everything I learned in acting school. But what it does is it's moving the experience out, because it's using breath, it's activating there. I'm seeing vagus nerve stuff going off all over the place, which is beautiful. But it's expressing yourself outwards through the lips and tongue. How fantastic!
Yeah, and sorry, another thing that Richard, you have taught me is that when you are curious, you're truly curious, it's very difficult or impossible to be anxious at the same time, simply because of the brain resources that we're using to be curious. So that puts us in a completely different frame, again, liberated from anxiety for those moments, which is
That's
awesome.
right. And when you feel that liberation, something else then opens up, right? Your prefrontal cortex is being challenged, and all of a sudden the amygdala, which holds so much emotion, is saying, oh, wow, this is interesting. I've never experienced this before. And I'm sitting with a therapist and I'm doing this. Yeah. And the therapist is saying, listen, while you're showering or bathing or going for a walk, I want you, if you don't feel comfortable doing the trilling, imagine doing it and see what happens. Probably a smile will come to your face. And if that smile happens, well, then what else is functioning as an interrupter? And I call them the cognitive interrupters.
Right.
Yeah. So this is flowing through so nicely, and I just keep going back to what's been belling in my head is Campbell and the journey. And this idea that you're really enriching is the journey is the movement through places that we're not familiar.
That's right.
The journey is not just going through familiar places. That's another aspect of Campbell's journey. But this opening up of the door into places that we not only to some extent, there's ones we don't want to go, or are cautious or scared or restricted in going to, but also those ones that we didn't even know were there.
I have to be honest. And sexual grief is a tough adversary. And when someone is used to being held hostage, they often don't want to leave it because it's what they know. And so you must understand that it's not a rejection of wanting to heal or wanting to grapple with that which one is faced with, but rather that it is very scary to go into the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And so I work a lot with metaphor, obviously hero's journey. And I work a lot with many different kinds of metaphor, like the Wizard of Oz, and all the characters of the Wizard of Oz as a way of bringing in that this, where we're going, that there's going to be places where you meet the quote, like the metaphorical Wicked Witch, and who that Wicked Witch might be for you, and to understand that there's that presence. And that curiosity is we must help you, I must, and align with being extricated from the hostage, the role of the hostage. There's also a kinship to that role, and to understand that we must tread lightly. We must revel, but not too much, because the hostage within the soul gets very scared. And so it is finding the levity, the balance, the calibration, which I talk about in my book, It's Grief, to help someone find the calibration of their growth, their shifting, their changing, and they're getting free from the hostage taker sexual grief, and helping anyone who's dealing with understand that it's not going to just go away. I promise you, it's still going to be there. The difference is that when it comes up, you're going to be able to tangle with it and challenge it in ways that you haven't been before.
What's it called when in long-term hostage situations where the people that are, the hostages are,
yeah, isn't it
it's that they have an affinity for
syndrome. It's
yeah,
Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome,
which actually is a bit questionable. But in principle, yes, what you do is
as a metaphor,
you create affinities. That's right.
Right. Yeah.
And
an apathy for the hostage taker.
Sure.
It is an apathy for, it is a caring for, it becomes a kinship for. Yeah.
And sorry,
associations and relationships.
Yeah. And this is something that largely, I don't know, a client's unaware of, that you bring into the light.
Oh, I will only bring it in when it presents itself, because I certainly don't want to invite it in. I know it's going to happen, but since I'm talking to clinicians here, it's something to be aware of. It's something to understand that as hopefully when this book comes out, you'll get it and you'll read it, and you'll come to some groups on it, and we'll talk about it. The idea here is that it's not smooth sailing just because you give some away that is the way to alleviate, the way to find some more inner peace or self-love. It's not a through line. And so to go back to that, the challenges of the hero shiro journey is that inmost cave is looking at the parts of the self that one does not want to look at and that one is not aware of. And so the places that one may not be aware of is where they have that kinship, where they have a caring for the hostage taker, because the fear is that they will forget, and they don't want to forget because, and that makes perfect sense, because we want to be able to remember so we don't repeat.
I mean, this is just so wonderful, Edy. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that Matt and I talk about quite regularly that is just beautifully expressed in all you're saying, which always encourages us when we hear somebody else. We should all sort of end up saying the same sort of stuff, because we're more or less the same being that we work with. And we've covered an enormous amount of territory, and unfortunately we have constraints of time because of people's attention and various bits and pieces. So we must talk again, and we must talk again when this book, when the new book comes out. But I'm wondering, is a couple of things. Either is there something we missed that you'd really like to address before we leave, or if there's just this opportunity now just to give it a roundedness, albeit a roundedness with 3 dots at the end.
I don't think you missed anything, although I did speak briefly about the Wizard of Oz, and I would just love to end on the Wizard of Oz, if I may. And that is that, she meets her travelers, and she is a traveler, and this work, the work that we do as clinicians, the work that our clients do, we're all travelers together. And so she meets her travelers, and she has her goals, Dorothy does, to finally get to the Emerald City that is going to get her home. That's all she wants. And the metaphor of home is really a wholeness, and is really self-love, and is really maturity. And she realizes that the wizard is not really who the wizard said was all that was made out to be, and that really was just this kind of little person hiding behind a veil. And that our work is really to help unveil, and to help perhaps ourselves, because we also come to this work with our own pain, and our clients realize that they have ruby slippers. They, all of us, have ruby slippers, because you've had the power all along to heal and to go home to the self.
That's so encouraging.
That's pretty beautiful. That's if we're rounding to that point, that's a really lovely point to round to. Thank you so much, Edy, for sharing your stuff.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Richard, and thank you, Matt, for allowing me to share this with both of you, and for sharing what you did with me here today.
Fantastic. Well, let's catch up again when the book is out, and we can talk further. But yeah, great to talk to you today. Thank you.
Thank you.